Welcome, everybody. This is Josh with Diving into Water Careers podcast from Josh's Water Drops. And today I have the pleasure to be with Roberto Lenton for our next senior professional interview for the podcast. So, welcome, Roberto. And yeah, would you please introduce yourself?
Well, Josh, thanks again for inviting me to be a part of this interview series. It's really a pleasure to be with you today. And just by way of background, as you may know, I'm from Argentina. Studied at the University of Buenos Aires. Afterwards, went on for graduate studies at MIT, and I've had a career that mostly spans the interface between water science and water policy. And I've tended to alternate between positions in academia and research and positions in policy organizations. And I've had the good fortune of, of really having great opportunities in both camps.
A question that I ask everybody to begin the interview with is there a body of water that you identify with, and tell us why?
Well, it's a great question. In my case, and I imagine in most people's cases, that body of water has to do with is normally close to where they grew up in, and in my case, it was the wetlands in the delta of the Paraná and Uruguay River, which which was very close to where I lived, and many of my weekends as a child was essentially rowing and canoeing in the rivers and streams of the delta, and it was a great experience and must have had some kind of an impact on what I did later on in life.
Wonderful. Um, so, what was your first water job, and how did you get it?
It was um, it was with the Secretariat for Water Resources of the government of Argentina. It was a very lucky coincidence that just as I was finishing my engineering studies in Argentina, the the government essentially established a new water resources secretariat. This was in the late '60s, and they it was brand new. Several countries, I guess, at that time were starting water resources ministries or secretariats, and Argentina was one of them, with a very visionary secretary, Guillermo Cano. And so they were recruiting for young professionals, and I put my name in with a couple of colleagues and got the job and ended up being a planning assistant, preparing the first maps of the river basins of Argentina. And so most of my first year there was on the drawing board and making these maps. So it was a lot of fun and a great experience, great thing to start out in.
Yeah, how did it, say working on the ground, working on the technical aspects, how did that then lay a foundation for your future work in policy?
Well, the the maps were directly linked to the overall policy of the government of Argentina of trying to manage water on a river basin basis. And so I could see what I was doing directly connected to that. But in a more practical sense, it laid the foundations because while I was there, the the same secretariat initiated a program with MIT to study one particular river basin in Argentina, which was the Colorado River Basin, just north of Patagonia. And so I was asked if I would like to be part of the group of six young professionals from Argentina that were going to be a part of that study. And so, about a year after I had started, I went off to MIT as part of this group. to study the Colorado River.
Mm.
And then that led to a number of developments later on, but it essentially led to my pursuing not only carrying out being a part of that study, but also pursuing master's and PhD degrees, and then after that, joining the faculty there.
Okay, nice. Yeah. Oddly enough, I did an internship at the uh, Universidad Nacional de Cuyo in
Oh,
Mendoza, where my
oh,
first task was digitizing maps of the Rio Mendoza. so,
fantastic!
so,
I had no idea about that connection. And that, what year was that?
that was 1998, 1990, no, 1997, 1998. Yeah. I was
Okay,
at the a geographic institute at the university. So yeah, spent a year, well, a semester there, and then I was at CELA, which was a
yeah.
think tank working under
Yes.
Armando Jop,
Oh,
also
okay.
on on privatization of water that the province was going through at the time. So
Right.
yeah, so yeah,
Yeah, well, I'm
big.
familiar with Sila and with Armando, and that must have been a great experience. And in fact, Mendoza was one of the five provinces that were involved in the that are part of the Rio Colorado River Basin. And so Mendoza was one of the five provinces involved in the study that took me to MIT.
Wonderful. And so, we talk a lot about, I talk a lot about mentors and role models. And I'd like to ask that question. I mean, did you have a role model or mentor or someone that inspired you to pursue water in your career, or just how they influenced your water career? And could you tell us how they influenced you?
I guess it was probably several rather than one at different stages. I think in the earlier stages in Argentina, it was probably um, one of my professors, Mario Fuschini Mejia, who was a hydrologist and expert on on the uh, on the hydrology of of flatland hydrology. And he was an eccentric character, difficult at times, but inspiring, and totally passionate and committed and for water issues. And so, even though I probably only interacted with him that my last year in college in Argentina, it probably had that impact. I I was, I think, motivated to specialize in water during my studies because of a couple of fellow students. So it wasn't a professor; it was a couple of fellow students who said, "Hey, why don't we study water?" It was a new field, and it was part of the concentration in civil engineering. So they influenced me. But later on in my career, after I started getting into international development issues, then there were at least a couple of people that had a big impact. One was, I guess, my boss at the Ford Foundation, Norman Collins, who had a lot of experience in development and introduced me to the issues. And another was Robert Chambers, whom you may know at IDS Sussex, a wonderful political scientist, and who really had such a fantastic vision. And he was my mentor and educator in everything to do with the social science dimensions of water. And I could name several others along the way. David Major, who was one of my professors at MIT and the person who first came to Argentina and suggested that I join the group. He's been a wonderful mentor, colleague, and friend. And in fact, we're still working together after all these years. So
Wow.
it's I've been fortunate to have had many people that have helped me in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's kind of the thing is that it is having many over your career at different points for different reasons.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And not only
Uh,
when not only when you're starting out, it really
of
is
course.
throughout one's life. Yeah,
Most definitely. Yeah, I still seek out mentors and
yeah,
always, ask for guidance.
yeah.
Um, so, I mean, you've gone into this a little bit, but what is the career, the trajectory of your career been? Can you guide us a little bit from when you started out at university until now?
Yeah, well, I've told the beginning part of this story, and I guess when I was asked to join the team at MIT, while I was there, um, was a couple of professors there said, "Look, why don't you put your name in for the master's program?" And so I did that. And while I was doing my master's, they said, "Well, why don't you put in your name for the PhD program?" Which I did, and I had a wonderful advisor there in Ignacio Rodriguez Iturbe. And then while I was doing my PhD, they said, "Well, we're always looking for young faculty," and so they invited me to become an assistant professor when I finished my studies there, which I did. Um, but after a while, I realized that what I really wanted to do was international development, and I really wanted to have an overseas experience, and that's when I started to investigate those opportunities. My colleague David Major, that I mentioned earlier, put me in touch with somebody at the Ford Foundation, and it turns out they were looking for somebody to manage their water management program out of their Delhi office in India. And so I interviewed with them, and a few months later found myself with my family in Delhi, and began what ended up being 9 wonderful years with the Ford Foundation, six in Delhi and three more in New York. And one of the really terrific things is when I was there, we got involved in the idea that was generating at that time of creating an international water management institute. And the Ford Foundation was asked to be the implementing agency. So I had the good fortune of being there at the idea stage, wrote one of the initial proposals for IMI, and then we were asked to be the implementing agency. And so that became a big part of my work at the Ford Foundation. And then in the early 80s, I guess, no, mid 80s, I felt that it was time to actually make the transition from being with the implementing agency to actually joining the institute. So I quit the Ford Foundation, joined the institute as deputy director general, and then moved to Sri Lanka with my family. And at that time, then after about a year, I was appointed director general and stayed there for another, what was it, 9 years until the mid 90s. So at that point, I was looking for something um, a bit broader beyond water management. At that time, IMI was very much water management for agriculture. I
Yeah.
was looking for something that would take me into other aspects of water, and more broadly environment. And so I wrote to a number of different people, one of them being the head of UNDP. And as it turns out, and it's been fortunate all my life in this respect, UNDP was just starting out a new division of environment and sustainable energy. And so in 1995, I think it was, I was asked to be director of that new division. And so we moved back to New York area, and and I joined UNDP as director of this new division. And as it turns out, when I was there, the idea of starting up the Global Water Partnership began. And it was in fact, it was the first meeting I had at UNDP was with the World Bank and the Swedish CEDA with this new idea of setting up the Global Water Partnership. So I got involved in the early stages of that. Um, so let's see. I think it was about 5 or 6 years after that, and UNDP was going through a major reform process. I was approached by some headhunters who were looking for somebody for the Earth Institute at Columbia University to assist in internationalizing their new institute on climate and society. So I joined the Earth Institute in that capacity as a special advisor for this new institute. And while I was there, um, really there was lots of major developments in the water area. One of them was the UN Millennium Project for, well, I guess for the Millennium Development Goals. And it had a task force on water and sanitation. And Jeff Sachs, who was at Columbia and the chair the head of this project, invited me to be the co-leader of this task force on water and sanitation. And at the same time, I was asked to be chair of the technical committee of the Global Water Partnership. So what happened is, even though I was at Columbia with the Earth Institute, a lot of my work there ended up being chairing these two initiatives, which were a lot of fun, and especially with the Global Water Partnership, it was a 6 year commitment that I really enjoyed, and it was very much along the lines of this interface of science and policy, really working with a tremendous team of people, um, for developing practical ideas for integrated water management. So that was great. And while I was there at Columbia, I was I think it was a colleague who made me aware of the fact that the World Bank was looking for a person for their inspection panel, and which you probably know is the main mechanism at the World Bank, whereby communities potentially or individuals potentially impacted by a World Bank finance project can have their concerns heard. And it seemed to be an interesting opportunity to work at critical policy levels across the board, not just in water, but across the board,
Yeah.
all aspects of development. So I put my name in for that and was selected for the panel. And part of the initial 2 years, I was a member of the panel alongside my work at GWP. But then after that, I became chair of that panel and remained there until about 10 years ago. And at that time, I thought I was going to go back to New York. But again, I was approached by headhunters who were looking for somebody to help them start a new institute on water and food at the University of Nebraska. So I ended up becoming the new director of this new institute in Nebraska, and a faculty member there, and it was great fun. It was a great opportunity. And so that was 6 years in Nebraska. And at the end of that, I decided to formally retire from the university, and have the flexibility to be able to do things that I cared about, and I wanted to have the opportunity to be able to write more and to reflect more. Um, and So that's where I am right now. And it provided the time and opportunity to take on the membership and then chairing the board of IWMI.
It's a long and storied career, so it's great to hear. And I mean, this is what we all aspire to. Um, so in now talking to our young professionals, like, so what's the best job advice that you ever received?
Um, well, advice in terms of getting jobs. Um, I guess someone, and I think he was actually a headhunter, said, when you're applying for a job, that's not the time to be modest, and self-effacing. And many of us tend to be modest and don't want to, speak too much about ourselves. But this person said, don't. You can be that way, but in a job interview, your job, in fact, is to put forward your strengths, and what you can bring to the position with the with as much frankness and honesty, and clarity as possible. So don't hold back. Just be very clear. Don't inflate, but at the same time be very clear on what you can bring to the position. So I thought that was good advice. I've tried to follow it, and it's really important to get just to get that right. Um, Being too modest, but also being too much the other way isn't
Yeah,
simply not gonna work.
yeah. So, and then on the flip side of that, is there any bad job advice that you've ever received?
You know, I think I've been lucky that I can't really remember any bad advice. It could be that it was so bad that I blocked it out of my consciousness, but I really can't think of any bad advice.
Mhm.
Maybe I've had advice that I just haven't taken too seriously, but I can't remember any really bad advice.
Bad, yeah. And then to someone who's just starting out their water career, are there any nuggets of wisdom that you pass along to someone who's just coming out of undergrad, looking for their first job, or looking at what their trajectory might look like? Like, what any nuggets of wisdom there?
Well, maybe a couple. One would be to have a general plan, but to be really flexible in responding to opportunities.
Yeah.
Virtually nothing that I've done has been part of a plan.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if anything, I had a general desire to be involved in international development, once I was at MIT. But so much of what I've done has been as a result of wanting to be flexible and wanting to, um, you know, when opportunities came, just to recognize this is an opportunity that I might miss if I hesitate, and then taking them on. So that would be one. The second is to look for opportunities when there's a choice where you would have, um, the maximum amount of authority, for that particular stage of your career, where you would be listened to as a young person. I really had the good fortune in my 20s of being, um, a faculty member at MIT, where when you're in your 20s, it's great. Your faculty members are that age. They're the most creative, and so they're highly respected. So that was great. And then I had the great fortune of, in my 30s, essentially being at the Ford Foundation, where again, the youngest people had the greatest direct impact on what happened. The ones, the more senior people were facilitators, but the ones that had the authority were the program officers. So we
Yeah.
were the ones who made things happen.
Yeah.
And and it was great. And there are other organizations that simply don't give that kind of opportunity to younger people. So
Yeah.
if there's a choice between being between a position that allows you to have that authority, and one that is more likely to be hierarchical, then go for the one that is that is less hierarchical, I would say.
Okay. Wow. That's great. Um, is there a moment? I mean, is there a moment in your career that you've had that's been really difficult, that you've had to work through, and how did you do that?
Yeah, I guess most people have. It's let's see which. Probably the one that most comes to mind is when I was winding up at IMI in Sri Lanka after 9 years and thinking of my next career move. And it was not easy because there was a lot of turmoil at IMI at that time. We'd gone through financial challenges, and it wasn't necessarily easy. We wanted to go back to the US or Europe, and being in Sri Lanka was a bit far away. And we had, at that time, two kids in college and two more about to go into college. So there was that consideration as well. There's a lot of pressure to find something and find it soon. And so that was probably the hairiest time. It actually all worked out nicely because, as I mentioned earlier, UNDP at that time happened to be looking for someone, and so there was a neat fit in that direction. In addition, the institute, we had arranged earlier for me to have a sabbatical in my final 6 months, and that sabbatical provided me an opportunity to make the transition and to recharge my batteries, as it were.
Yeah.
So it all worked out for the good, but it was hairy, and
Mm,
I think most people have to be recognize that there are going to be hairy times, and you've got to figure out a way to deal with them when they come.
mm, yeah. So yeah, you've had a long and storied career. So what are you most proud of after all these years?
Well, it probably it probably is the the fact that I was given the opportunity to be involved in the startup of these three really creative new institutions. And it's always fun to be involved in a startup, but to be involved in three of them, I think, is a great it's a gift in many ways. And I'm proud of the fact that those three institutions have all become leaders in their field. And so looking back, it's really a delight to have seen them grow. At that time, we had no idea of how they would develop, but to see IMI to go from what when we first conceived of it, it was going to be a very small institute focused on the management of irrigation systems, and now it's still small, but considerably bigger than it was before, with scientists, across across the world working on many different aspects of water. And the same with the Global Water Partnership, and with the same with the Water for Food Institute at the University of Nebraska. Of
Yeah.
course, that one is much younger and more limited in scope. So I'm very proud of that, and very grateful for the opportunity to have had a role in it, which is not something that I expected. It just happened to fall in my lap in all three cases, but it was just a great thing to do.
So, and looking forward, and at this point in your career, what are your hopes for the water community in looking in the future?
Well, it hopefully it would be more cohesive, more able to speak with one voice, to have a stronger and more impactful presence in the global arena. If you compare the water community with, say, the climate change community or the biodiversity community, they have been much more able, I think, to to have a coherent voice, and to make people stand up and listen. Um, and within the water community, that hasn't happened as yet. So I do think that there is a real need for that kind of cohesiveness to happen. I think there are signs that of going in that direction, but I think it needs a lot more effort and determination.
Yeah. Yeah, we're a very fragmented
Yeah.
community. And yeah, well, one can hope that, with the 2023 conference coming up, that we can, yeah, become more cohesive, at least for that moment, to really kind of elevate the topic of water.
Yeah, and that I think that 2023 conference is really, really important, and I think it's something to pay attention to and to have as a goal, the the need to become more coherent as a community.
Yeah. Yeah. So, where do you see yourself in the next 5 years? And how do you think about your future now in your career different than how you did, at the beginning?
Well, it's an important stage, and I've touched a little bit on it earlier. But most of my career has, in the last 20, 30 years, has been focused principally on making things happen, and being in more executive roles. I see myself now being more in a role um, of guiding rather than directly making things happen. The work on the board of IMI has been really exciting, because it's a very important moment in the Institute's development. But I feel I can best contribute in leading the board rather than leading the Institute.
Yeah,
And I think that it's this is a good stage to be uh, in that in that role.
wonderful. So, part of this interview series with young and professionals, senior professionals, is that we try to have a little bit of an intergenerational dialogue between. So we ask the previous interviewee to pose a question to the next. So we'll ask you to pose a question, but first, so my last interview was with Deepesh Jain, and he works for MSF in Sierra Leone. And he had a few questions, and I'm going to read them so I get them all correct. But what were the challenges in developing the water and sanitation sector that we have today? And where do you see this sector going in the future? Not only in terms of what contributions it may make, but also as an industry that contributes to the economy. And lastly, how could young professionals best prepare themselves for the challenges and opportunities that you can foresee they may encounter in this sector in the future?
Yeah, those were big questions and great questions. And I did write them down here. Yeah, in terms of the challenges in developing the water and sanitation sector, I started my career 50 years ago. It really was at that time very narrow in its approach, very sectoral, very engineering driven. That was the dominant profession in the water field. And even though I was myself an engineer, I could recognize that it was limiting, and generally speaking, very local.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
local people dealing with local issues. And I think that there's really been a sea change since that time, that people tend to view things in a broader way, looking at the interconnections. They tend to be much more multidisciplinary. People involved in the field, if you go to Stockholm, the participants will come from a very wide range of disciplines, but also sectors and perspectives and countries and regions. So you have much more diversity, and you're also, I think, some of the battles that we had to fight earlier have been fought, such as being concerned about environmental impacts, being concerned about uh, the linkages between water and a variety of aspects of development. I think those battles have largely been fought. The emphasis on management, for example, in the earlier stages was virtually non-existent, and I think that's very much accepted now. So I do think that there were some real challenges before. We have a different set of challenges now um, than we had at that time. In terms of where the sector is going in the future, and not only in terms of the contributions it can make, but also as an industry that contributes to the economy. Um, I think we touched on this before a little bit, Josh, that the just the need for more cohesiveness, more having a stronger voice, being able to make the case that water is an important contributor to the economy.
Yeah.
That I think is one of the things that really is needed going forward. I think all of us recognize that water is hugely important to all aspects of life, but being able to make the case, and especially the economic case, I think is a big challenge nowadays. Um, and in terms of how can young professionals best prepare themselves, we touched on a little bit on this before, in terms of looking for positions that provide you with the opportunity to make a difference, to be impactful, where you're given responsibility at a young age. I think that's important. Part of the preparation. I would add to that maybe combining breadth and depth. Um, Sometimes that's difficult. You tend to find people who become very, very good in a very narrow area, and others who look very broadly at things. You really, in an ideal world, you have a bit of both. You look for an opportunity that allows you to become a real expert in one thing, but retain at the same time the capacity to see the linkages and the and the broader meaning.
Uh, that's really good. Thank you. I hope, I think Deepesh will be quite happy with that comprehensive response. So, and then now, our next interviewee, what would be a young professional? What's the question that you would pose to that person?
Um, yeah, that's a good one. I guess I would say, if in a sense it's a of flip side of the previous question, which is what would you really what what support do you need in order to be able to, do you see yourself needing in order to be able to succeed in your professional? What support do you need from individuals? What support do you need from institutions that will allow you to achieve your fullest potential? Being it would be it would be great to hear from a young professional saying very clearly, "This is what I need. This is what I need from you. This is what I need from my employer." And it might then allow people to start reflecting a little bit as to how they might best assist young professionals.
And then, yeah, and Josh's Water Jobs will be listening to see how we can help as well. So,
Good, good. Well, I think you're doing a fantastic service, Josh, and that's
thanks.
why I've always been following your your newsletters and your weekly uh, emails, because I think it's a real service to the community, especially the community of young professionals. And I think this podcast series is a further step in that regard. So it's really important what you're doing.
Thank you, much appreciated. And thank you very much for this interview. It was really, yeah. There's a lot of, it was very rich, a lot of depth there. So I really appreciate you taking the time. Um, and yeah, hopefully we can do this again sometime.
Great. Well, thanks, Josh. Thanks for inviting me, and glad that I could be a part of it. And good luck with your future interviews.
Great, thank you, Roberto.
Thank you.
All right,
All the
bye
best,
bye.
then. Bye bye.